He spent his life making sure they could never burn. He never imagined he would have to fear the water. There is a particular cruelty in the way the world disposes of its greatest things. It rarely lets them die in their prime, cleanly, while they are still magnificent. It prefers the long humiliation, the decades of layup, the changes of name, the gutting, the rust, the committee that cannot find the money, the tow to a foreign beach or a quiet patch of gulf, the slow public disillusion watched by people who can do nothing but watch. This is the story of one man who built two of the most beautiful and capable ships the United States ever put to sea, who made them, by sheer force of obsession, nearly impossible to destroy by the thing that destroys ships, and of how the sea took them both, and of how the sea took both of them anyway, with a great deal of human help, long after their glory was spent and long before their worth was. The man was William Francis Gibbs. The ships were the SS America and the SS United States. They are storied vessels with storied lives, lives long enough and strange enough that a full accounting reads less like a pair of ships' biographies than like a single century-spanning meditation on what a nation will build when it means to be the best, and what it will let happen to the best once it has stopped meaning it. To understand why their fall lands like a death in the family, why it should land that way on anyone who reveres what the finest American hands can make. You have to start with the boy on the dock, and then you have to follow both ships all the way down. In 1894, an 8-year-old boy in Philadelphia stood at the launching of the great American liner SS St. Louis and watched her slide down the ways into the water. And something in him fixed permanently on a single idea, that he would one day build the greatest ship his country had ever seen. The boy was William Francis Gibbs, and the obsession that took hold of him that day never once loosened its grip across the next 70 years of his life. He was not by training a naval architect. His family expected respectability, so he studied at Harvard and then took a law degree and passed the bar, and practiced law almost not at all, because the ships would not let him go. He taught himself marine engineering with a ferocity that bordered on the monastic, reading every technical paper he could find, drawing hulls obsessively, studying the lines and the machinery of every vessel he could get near, teaching himself the mathematics of displacement and stability in steam. The self-taught amateur made himself, by raw will, into the most formidable ship designer in America. With his brother Frederick, he founded the firm that became Gibbs and Cox. And that firm became the drafting room behind an astonishing share of the ships that won the Second World War. Thousands of warships and cargo vessels designed or influenced by Gibbs's relentless standardization and engineering discipline. When Americans say the arsenal of democracy, a meaningful fraction of what they are describing came off of Gibbs's drawing boards. He was exacting to the point of legend, and well past the point of comfort for anyone who worked with him. He was difficult, obsessive, controlling, indifferent to charm, physically restless, and capable of letting a single detail go unperfected. He wore the same kind of dark suit and battered hat every day so he would not have to think about it. He haunted his own ships. These are not ordinarily words of praise, but pointed at the right target, at the genuine article, at the thing actually worth getting right. That exacting nature is precisely what separates a marvel from a product, a masterpiece from a merely adequate job. Gibbs did not want a good ship. He wanted the uncompromised ship. And he was entirely willing to be insufferable to get it. The America and the United States are what that obsession looks like when it is finally permitted to take physical form. The SS America came first, and her life alone could fill a book. Laid down in 1938 at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, Launched on the last day of August 1939 with Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of the sitting president, as her sponsor, and completed in 1940 for the United States lines. She was a graceful, modern, unmistakably American liner of about 26,000 gross tons and 723 feet. She was not yet the masterwork. She was the rehearsal for it. The full-scale working out of the ideas about safety, watertight subdivision, clean design, and fire protection that Gibbs would later push to their absolute limit. Her interiors, notably, were designed in large part by women, a rarity for the age, and she was meant to be the proud flagship of American passenger service on the Atlantic. History had other plans almost immediately. She had barely begun commercial service when the war swept her up. Requisitioned and converted into the troop transport USS West Point, she spent the war years carrying soldiers across both oceans, hundreds of thousands of them, voyage after voyage, through submarine-haunted waters, and served her country with quiet, grinding faithfulness through the entire conflict. When peace came, she was returned to the United States lines, refitted and restored to her proper name and her proper work, carrying passengers across the Atlantic for 2 more decades. She was a fine ship, genuinely loved, and she did honest work. But her deepest significance is structural in 2 senses. First, she was the bridge, the vessel in which Gibbs proved, at sea and at scale, the principles that the United States would carry to their conclusion. Everything the America was, the United States would be more of: faster, safer, lighter, bolder, far less compromised. The daughter was the draft. The masterwork was coming. And second, though no one could have known it in 1940, she would also, decades later, become the first of Gibbs's 2 great ships to show the world exactly how cruelly a magnificent thing can be allowed to end. The SS United States. She entered service in 1952, and there had never been anything quite like her. 990 feet long, better than 53,000 gross tons, 12 decks, capable of carrying nearly 2,000 passengers in an era when crossing the Atlantic by sea was still how the world moved, and underneath the elegance, a machine of genuinely warlike capability. She was the product of a deliberate national bargain. The United States government subsidized her construction, and in exchange, she was built to be convertible on relatively short notice into a high-speed troop transport capable of carrying some 15,000 soldiers anywhere in the world, fast enough to outrun any submarine then afloat. She was a liner with the heart of a warship, and that was entirely the point. Understand the moment she was born into. It was 1950. The Iron Curtain down, Korea erupting, the memory of how desperately the Allies had needed fast troop ships in the last war still fresh in every admiral's mind. The America herself had spent her best years as the troop ship USS West Point precisely because the nation had been caught short of fast hulls. So the Navy and the Maritime Administration struck a deal with United States lines. The government would underwrite a very large share of the cost of building the fastest, finest liner in the world, and in return she would be designed from the keel up as a latent weapon of state, a vessel that could be requisitioned and converted in a matter of days into a trooper able to carry an entire division at a speed no submarine could match. Her watertight subdivision was engineered to naval survivability standards. Her range at speed was enormous. Her fuel capacity, her compartmentation, her very bones were drawn with war in mind, then wrapped in the most elegant passenger accommodations afloat. This is why her true performance was a state secret. The figures that mattered, her real top speed, her precise power, the details of her hull form and propellers were classified for years because they described not merely a fast liner, but a strategic asset. There is a story that captures the absurdity and the gravity of it at once. In 1976, the Norwegian shipping magnate Knut Kloster tried to buy the laid-up United States for his cruise line and was refused by the U.S. Maritime Administration on the grounds that her design features were still classified. Turned away, he would years later buy the great French flagship SS France and make her the SS Norway. The United States' own secrecy, the very thing that made her a national treasure, helped slam the door on one of the earliest serious chances to give her a second life. Her classification was lifted the following year. Too late for that particular rescue. She was so important that her importance got in her way. There is something almost unbearably fitting in that. To grasp what she truly was, look at her machinery, because this is where the legend lives. Her propulsion plant was not merely liner-grade engineering scaled up. It was, in type and in pedigree, naval capital ship engineering. She was driven by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, generating high-pressure superheated steam on the order of 925 pounds per square inch at roughly 975 degrees, feeding 4 sets of Westinghouse double reduction geared steam turbines turning 4 shafts. That is the same family of plant, the same fundamental architecture of high-pressure boilers and geared turbines that drove the fast battleships of the United States Navy. The Iowa-class battleships, Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin, the fastest battleships ever built, ran on 8 boilers and 4 sets of geared turbines producing 212,000 shaft horsepower, enough to push 57,000 tons of armored warship past 33 knots. Now hold that number against the liner. The SS United States was rated at 240,000 shaft horsepower, and on her trials, she reportedly delivered closer to 247,000. Read that again, because it is one of the most astonishing facts in 20th century engineering. A passenger liner outpowered an Iowa-class battleship. The ship, built to carry tourists and their steamer trunks across the Atlantic, put more horsepower through her shafts than the most powerful battleships the United States ever sent to war. She was, in the most literal, mechanical sense, a thoroughbred warhorse dressed as a show pony, and she could run. On her maiden voyage, in July 1952, she took the Blue Riband, the prize for the fastest transatlantic crossing by a passenger liner. And she did not merely take it, she demolished it, crossing eastbound at an average speed that left every ship in the history of the world behind her, including the storied Cunard Queens that held the record for years. She broke it again westbound on the same voyage. No ship had ever crossed that fast. And here is the line that ought to be carved in bronze somewhere, more than 70 years later. No passenger liner has ever taken that eastbound record from her. She was retired, undefeated, and she remains undefeated to this day. Time, the only honest measure there is, never produced her superior. And yet, here's the part that haunts me most. She was never run to her true limit. Her trials touched at least 38 knots. In service, she cruised comfortably around 30 and was clocked as high as 36. But her genuine top speed, the number at the far end of nearly 250,000 horsepower, was kept classified for decades. A guarded military secret because of how fast America's convertible troop ship could actually move with strategic information. The figures that have surfaced over the years suggest that she had a great deal more in her than she was ever publicly allowed to show. The fastest ocean liner ever built, the holder of a record that has stood for 3 generations, was very probably faster still than her own legend. And the world was never permitted to find out by how much. There's a phrase for what that is: a development curve deliberately left unfinished. The apex of a craft with reserve beyond the apex, and the reserve sealed away. The lore that grew up around her speed has the ring of truth precisely because the forces involved were so violent. At the velocity she reached, the water did not merely part around her, it scoured her. The story long told about her is that she ran so fast on trials that the sheer force of the sea stripped the paint clean off her hull plating. Whether or not every retelling is exact, the physics is not gentle. Drive nearly 1,000 feet of steel through the North Atlantic at better than 40 miles an hour, and the ocean fights back hard enough to peel her. That was the cost of her speed, and she paid it without flinching. She was built to be driven. For 17 years, she was the proudest moving object the United States possessed. She carried 4 sitting or future presidents, movie stars and statesmen, and immigrants and ordinary families. The Mona Lisa on her famous 1963 voyage home to France, and the everyday human traffic of an era when the ocean liner was still the dignified way across the water. She was a floating piece of the country, fast, modern, safe, unmistakably American. The physical proof of what the nation can build when it set its mind to being the best in the world at something difficult and chose not to compromise. She was, in the truest sense of the word, Gibbs would have hated for its sentimentality and deserved anyway. Magnificent. And here's the quiet miracle inside the fireproof fanaticism. She was not cold. A lesser mind told it could use no wood, no flammable fabric. Nothing that might need a flame would have produced a sterile steel box. Instead, Gibbs handed the interiors to the designer Dorothy Markwald of the firm Smythe, Urquhart, and Markwald, and she performed something close to alchemy. A clean, confident, optimistic mid-century modern aesthetic built entirely from materials that could not burn. Aluminum, glass, spun fiberglass, and other non-combustibles were shaped into something genuinely beautiful. Cool greens and golds and grays, sweeping modern lines, an ocean liner glamour that felt like the future rather than a fortress. The draperies were woven of glass fiber. The decorative panels and sculptures and the great aluminum leaf artworks were chosen and commissioned within the iron rule. And the rule did not strangle the art. It disciplined it into a style. She proved a thing worth proving, that the exacting constraint, the refusal to compromise on the thing that matters most, does not have to kill beauty. Done by the right hands, the constraint becomes the style. The fireproof ship was one of the loveliest interiors ever to cross an ocean, and she was lovely because of her limits, not in spite of them. To understand the soul of these ships, and the soul of the man, you have to understand the one word that governed every decision Gibbs made: fire. He had come up in an era that knew precisely, viscerally, what fire did to a ship full of human beings. The catastrophe of the liner Morro Castle, which burned off the New Jersey coast in 1934 with the loss of well over 100 lives, was seared into the consciousness of every serious naval architect of his generation. A ship at sea is a sealed world. There's nowhere to run from a fire but into the water. Gibbs resolved that his masterwork could not burn, and he pursued that resolution with a fanaticism that has become the central legend of his life. The SS United States was built with almost nothing flammable aboard her. Her superstructure used aluminum on a scale never before attempted in a ship, a decision that served fire safety and weight reduction and therefore speed all at once, which is exactly how the very best engineering decisions tend to work, paying off in 3 currencies at once. Below and throughout, the rule was absolute: no wood, not in the paneling, not in the furniture, not in the decorative fittings, not in the draperies, which were woven of glass fiber and other non-combustibles. Every fabric, every surface, every fixture was chosen or invented to refuse a flame. The lore, and it is the kind of lore that is true to the spirit of the thing, even where the precise details blur in the retelling. holds that the only wood permitted aboard the entire vessel was the butcher's block in the galley and the grand pianos, and that Gibbs fought bitterly even over those. The most famous version of the tale is him demanding a fireproof piano, pressing the manufacturer until, to settle the argument about whether the proposed wood would burn, a piano was doused in gasoline and set alight on a dock to prove the point one way or the other. Whether every element of that story is literally exact hardly matters to the truth it carries. It is true to the man. William Francis Gibbs would unhesitatingly burn a piano on a pier to win an argument, if winning the argument meant that no passenger of his would ever burn at sea. That is the exacting nature in its purest distillation, the flat refusal to accept good enough, the willingness to be impossible, relentless, and alone in the service of getting the genuine article right. And it worked. Across all her years of service, through every crossing, the great fear never came for her. Gibbs built a ship that fire could not have. He fought the war he set out to fight, and he won it completely. The tragedy, the thing no amount of genius could have foreseen or engineered against, is that the enemy which finally took both of his great ships was the one element a shipbuilder never thinks to fear, because it is the very element a ship is made to live in. Not fire, water. What killed the great liners was not any flaw in them. It was the sky. In October of 1958, the first transatlantic commercial jet service began. And a journey that took the fastest ship on Earth 3.5 days could suddenly be made in well under a single day. Within a decade, the ocean liner as a means of transportation was simply, irreversibly obsolete. No amount of speed on the water, not even 250,000 horsepower, not even a record that would never be broken, could compete with speed in the air. It was not a fair fight, and it was not a close one. The thing the liners were supreme at became a thing almost no one needed anymore. The United States, the fastest of them all, hung on until 1969 and was then withdrawn from service after only about 17 years. 17 years. Set that against the decades of a working life an ordinary vessel expects, and the cruelty becomes clear. The single finest, fastest, most advanced ocean liner ever constructed spent barely a third of her normal career doing the work she was built for before the world's needs moved into the air above her. It was nobody's fault, and it was a tragedy regardless. The apex of an entire craft, rendered irrelevant not by a better ship, because there was no better ship, and there has not been one since, but by a different sky. From there, both of Gibbs's daughters entered the long purgatory that so often awaits the magnificent but obsolete. The limbo of the thing too grand to scrap easily and too impractical to use. The America slide is almost unbearable to recite in full, sold off and renamed and renamed and renamed again. She became the Australis under the Greek flag of Chandris, carrying immigrants to Australia for years in one of her more dignified second acts. Then briefly the America once more, then the Italis, then the Noga, then the Alfredos, then finally the American Star. A parade of names, each one a further step away from what she had been, each new owner a little less able or willing to honor her. The proud flagship, reduced to a hand-me-down, passed between people chasing schemes that mostly failed. The United States, for her part, was laid up, her magnificent fittings auctioned off piecemeal, and in the early 1990s she was towed across the Atlantic to Turkey and then Ukraine, and there she was gutted. Her interior stripped to bare steel, her asbestos torn out wholesale, the entire living soul of her scrapped from the body until nothing remained but the hull and the empty superstructure. The vessel Gibbs had filled with such obsessive fireproof care was hollowed to a shell, an echo of herself. Then she was towed to a pier in Philadelphia, and there she sat, rusting and empty and enormous, for very nearly 30 years. The America went first, and she went hard, and she went in public. By the early 1990s, she was the American star, sold yet again with the intention of her being refitted into a moored hotel ship in the Far East. In January of 94, she was under tow toward Thailand when, in heavy weather off the Canary Islands, her tow lines parted. Her crew was lifted off by helicopter, and the abandoned ship drifted helplessly through the night. On the morning of January 18, 1994, wind and sea drove her broadside aground at Playa de Garce on the wild western coast of Fuerteventura. The point of impact could hardly have been worse. Bow and stern in the sand, the midsection across a rock formation. The sea did not wait, and it did not show mercy. Within 48 hours, the relentless Atlantic surf had broken the ship in two just past the funnel, and she was declared a total loss. And then began the long, public, agonizing disillusion. The stern section collapsed and sank in 1996. The bow stood on the sandbar for years, listing harder with every season of storms, becoming a strange pilgrimage site. Tourists and ship lovers traveling to Fuerteventura specifically to photograph the great American liner slowly coming apart on the rocks. The funnel detached and toppled into the water. By 2006, the wreck had largely collapsed onto its port side. By 2007, the structure broke and slid into the sea. And by the 2010s, she was simply gone from the surface. Her remains dissolved by the patient, tireless ocean into a scattered debris field on the sand of a foreign beach. By 2013, she could no longer even be seen by satellite imagery. The element a ship is built to ride had taken her apart, piece by piece, in full view of the world, over the better part of 20 years. In the end, she became, by pure attrition, an accidental reef, a great American liner reduced to a place where fish gather in the shallows off the Canaries. The United States lingered far longer than her sister, and her ending is being written in our own moment. The slow result of a half-century of hope raised and hope dashed, again and again, by a parade of owners who all wanted to save her, and none of whom could. The government sold her out of the reserve fleet at the end of the 1970s, and from there she passed through hand after hand, each gripping her with real intentions, and each, in the end, letting go. There were plans across the 1980s to make her a cruise ship, a hospital ship, anything. There was the gutting in the 1990s. There was the long Philadelphia layup. And twice, two different times, the flicker of genuine hope flared bright enough to break your heart when it went out. In April 2003, Norwegian Cruise Lines bought her, and for a moment it looked like resurrection. NCL's owner announced plans to rehabilitate the Big U and return her to service under the American flag as a modern cruise ship, to make her sail again, under her own power. The thing every person who loved her had dreamed of for 30 years. For anyone who revered her, that was the moment the pulse jumped. Not a museum, not a static hulk, but the fastest liner ever built moving across the water once more as a living ship. The hope was real, and the hope was almost certainly never realistic. Industry veterans were skeptical from the start. The cost of converting a 50-year-old ocean liner to modern cruise standards ran to many times the cost of simply building a new ship. And the economic crisis of the late 2000s finished what the math had already doomed. NCL owned her from 2003 to 2011. And, by most honest accounts, did almost nothing in those years but survey her exhaustively and let her sit. By 2009, she was listed for sale again, and then NCL began accepting bids from scrappers. The revival that had set so many hearts racing turned out to be 8 years of a great ship, sitting at a pier under an owner who had moved on, ending with the breakers at the door. A second flicker came in 2016, when Crystal Cruises, under, remarkably, the very same man who had owned NCL, announced his own plan to restore her to service, commissioned the feasibility study, released the renderings, and then, within months, quietly walked away for exactly the same reasons. Twice the dream of seeing her sail was lit, and twice it was the same arithmetic that blew it out. When NCL turned to the scrappers, a nonprofit stepped into the breach. The SS United States Conservancy, led by Susan Gibbs, the granddaughter of the man who designed her, which gives the whole final chapter the shape of a family trying to save its own. In 2010, the Conservancy secured a leadership gift from the Philadelphia philanthropist H.F. Jerry Lindfest, and in 2011, it bought the ship outright for $3 million, rescuing her from the breaker's yard at the last hour. For 13 years, the Conservancy kept her alive. That deserves to be said first and plainly, because it is true and it is honorable. Without them, she would have been razor blades by 2011, and instead she stood whole for another decade and a half. They are the reason there was anything left to grieve. And yet the honest accounting cannot stop at the devotion, because the stewardship was, by any fair reading, troubled. And the trouble matters, because it is part of how the genuine article comes to be lost. The fundamental problem never went away. The Conservancy owned a 1,000-foot ship and never secured a viable, funded plan for what to actually do with her. Plan after plan was announced, and renderings released, and partners courted. A mixed-use museum and hotel, a waterfront attraction, the New York Pier 76 redevelopment with the real estate firm RXR and MCR hotels, and plan after plan quietly collapsed, none ever reaching the funding and the permits and the home that would have made it real. Meanwhile, the ship bled money simply existing. The dockage and insurance and upkeep ran to tens of thousands of dollars a month. By some accounts, around 80,000. A relentless drain that swallowed donation after donation just to keep her floating in place, going nowhere. As early as 2015, with funds running low, the Conservancy was already accepting scrapping bids before a fundraising push pulled her back from the edge. For 13 years, she was kept alive without ever being given a future, preserved but not saved, floating but not going anywhere. A magnificent thing held in stasis at enormous cost, while the actual plan to redeem her never, ever closed. Whether to call that mismanagement or simply an impossible task attempted by the well-meaning is a fair argument, and the truth is probably both. The Conservancy was outgunned by the sheer scale of the thing. 1,000 feet of ship that can dock almost nowhere, cannot moor at sea, and costs a fortune to so much as keep still, attached to a restoration bill running into the hundreds of millions. But devotion without a closable plan is not a strategy, and 13 years of paying to keep a treasure motionless, while the rescue perpetually fails to materialize, is, in the cold light, a kind of slow-motion failure dressed as preservation. They loved her enough to keep her. They could not assemble what it would have taken to truly save her. And the money and the years spent keeping her in limbo were money and years that bought, in the end, no future at all, only a delay before the inevitable. That is the hardest thing to say about people who genuinely tried. But these ships deserve the whole truth, and the whole truth is that good intentions and real devotion, uncoupled from a workable plan and the will to fund it, are not enough to save the genuine article. They were never enough. They were only enough to postpone the loss. What finally doomed her was not a grand decision about her future. It was a landlord dispute. The Conservancy had held her at Pier 82 in South Philadelphia since taking ownership in 2011 under a berthing agreement of $850 a day. In August 2021, the pier operator, Penn Warehousing, abruptly doubled the rate to $1,700 with little notice. The Conservancy refused to pay the increase, kept paying the original rate, and Penn Warehousing terminated the lease in March 2022 and sued. The fight ground through federal court for 2 years. In June 2024, Judge Anita Brody ruled a split decision. The landlord could not arbitrarily double the rent and was owed no great pile of back damages. But the berthing agreement was terminable, and the ship had to go. A 90-day clock started, and there was nowhere for a 1,000-foot vessel to go. No pier would take her. She could not moor at sea. No redevelopment home had ever been secured. Pen warehousing, the Conservancy alleged, had maneuvered to extract a $3 million payment and to interfere with the ship's relocation, even attempting to broker its own sale of a vessel it did not own. With the eviction clock running and every other door shut, the only remaining buyer was Okaloosa County, Florida, and the only thing the county wanted her for was for the bottom of the Gulf. So read the chain of causes plainly, because it is its own kind of indictment. The fastest ocean liner ever built, structurally sound, undefeated against time. The masterwork of a great American designer is being sent to the seafloor not because of a considered national judgment that she was not worth saving, but as the downstream result of a rent dispute. A doubled dockage fee, a refused increase, a terminated lease, a court order, a 90-day clock, and no home to go to. And at the bottom of that small, sordid, entirely human cascade lies the grave of a national treasure. The Conservancy, in announcing the end, told its supporters that the landlord's actions had ended their ability to keep searching, and that they were unlikely to realize their shared dream. That is how the genuine article dies in the real world. Not in a clean, tragic blaze that fire could have spared her. In a contract fight over pure rent, with the magnificent thing as collateral damage. And so she was acquired by Okaloosa County, towed from her Philadelphia pier down to Mobile, Alabama in 2025, where crews spent months stripping and remediating and cleaning her, removing her 2 great funnels and her mast for a future land-based museum, preparing her hull for one last purpose, to be towed out into the Gulf of Mexico off the Florida Panhandle and deliberately sunk in roughly 180 feet of water, to become the largest artificial reef on Earth, a dive site some 20-odd miles off Destin Fort Walton Beach. Hold the 2 fates side by side, because the difference between them is the whole moral of the thing. The America was lost to neglect, abandoned mid-tow on the way to a second life that fell through, taken by storm and bad luck and indifference. The United States will be lost to intent, sent to the bottom deliberately, on a schedule, with permits, not because she could not be saved, but because saving her required work and money and a closed plan that, across half a century and a dozen owners and one devoted family foundation, no one ever managed to assemble. That is not a mercy killing. You do not mercy kill the structurally sound. A viable thing still capable of restoration is being destroyed on purpose because restoration was harder and costlier than destruction. The lesser path chosen over the greater. The acceptance of good enough, let her go, over the demanding work of she is worth saving, so save her. It is the precise opposite of the spirit in which Gibbs built her. And the final symmetry is almost too much to bear. Both of his great ships, the entire surviving legacy of the boy who dreamed of them on a dock at the age of 8, come to the same end, underwater, off a coast, turned into a reef, one by accident, one by design. He built 2 of the finest ships America ever made, and the sea is being given both of them. I want to set down something I witnessed with my own eyes, because the truest thing I can offer about what this costs the people who still know how to look, and because no archive holds it but mine. When the United States was towed from Philadelphia down to Mobile in 2025, her long, slow journey carried her past the coast of Florida, my coast, my home water, I went out with a pair of binoculars, and I stood and I watched her pass. I had revered this ship for as long as I can remember. The fastest liner ever built, the undefeated holder of the Blue Riband, the vessel that outpowered a battleship, the apex of an entire American craft, the genuine article rendered in steel and aluminum by a man who would not compromise. And in all the years I had loved her, I had never once seen her move. She had been a static thing my whole life, laid up at a pier, gutted and rusting, a photograph in a book, a record in a table, a legend that did not stir. That tow was the only time I would ever see her in motion. Understand what that means. The fastest ocean liner in the history of the world, the ship whose entire reason for existing was speed, whose soul was velocity, who once ran so hard the sea stripped the paint from her hull, who held in reserve a top speed so formidable the government sealed it as a secret. And the single time in my life I watched her move across the water, she was being dragged, powerless, dark, lifeless under tow. Her funnels bound for a museum, her hull bound for the bottom. The one motion I was ever granted of the swiftest thing ever to cross an ocean was the slow, helpless final motion of her journey to her grave. She moved, and not 1 foot of it was her own. The speed was gone. Only the going remained. I lowered the binoculars and understood that I had just watched the entire tragedy compressed into a single image. The genuine article, undefeated by time, never beaten by fire, magnificent in her bones and still structurally sound, towed past me on her way to be deliberately sunk, because the world had found it easier to drown her than to do the work of bringing her back to life. Gibbs made her unburnable. He could not make her unabandonable. No engineer can build a ship that is proof against a civilization's indifference. That part was never in his power. It was in ours, and we failed it, not once, but twice, with both of his daughters, in the same dark way. So I set this down on purpose and at length for the America and for the United States, and for the difficult, brilliant, obsessive, unyielding man who dreamed them both into being and drove everyone around him half mad in the service of getting them right. He did everything right. He made them beautiful, and he made them fast, and he made them safe. He gave the liner the heart of a battleship and the soul of a perfectionist. He made them the very best of what his country could build, and he made them above all, and against the oldest terror of the sea, impossible to burn. The one thing William Francis Gibbs could not engineer was a world that would value his ships enough to keep them. That was never his job, and it was never within the reach of any drawing board. It was ours, and we let the water have what the fire never could. But the record outlives the ship, and that matters more than it sounds. She still holds the Blue Riband, more than 70 years on, undefeated, unbroken, the fastest there has ever been. Time never produced her better, and the sea, whatever it does to her hull on the floor of the Gulf, cannot take that from her. The fact of what she was, what she did, what one impossible man proved was achievable when he refused, flatly and to the end, to accept anything less than the uncompromised thing. The hull goes to the reef. The achievement does not go anywhere. It is fixed, permanent, on the record, undefeated forever. And as long as someone remembers Gibbs at 8 on the launching dock, remembers the gasoline in the piano, remembers a liner that outpowered a battleship and ran so fast it shed its own paint, remembers the maiden voyage that shattered every record in the world, remembers the America dissolving on a beach in the Canaries, and a man on the Florida coast with binoculars watching the fastest ship ever built be dragged lifeless toward her grave, then the genuine article is not entirely lost. This is the whole of what a keeper can do. The keeper cannot stop the sinking. The money and the will were never his to command. The keeper can only do one thing, and it is not a small thing. He can make certain that what is sunk is remembered as what it actually was, the best, undefeated, structurally sound to the end, and worth infinitely more than the work that nobody would do to save it. Write it down. Keep it true. Let the reef have the steel. The story is ours. He made them so that they could never burn. The sea took them anyway, and we let it. She outpowered a battleship and outran the world, and the only time I ever saw her move, she was going to her grave. Undefeated still. Remember her that way.